Hello and welcome back. I'm here with you today to talk about my favorite books of 2024. So we're going to go from number 10 to the best book that I read this year. And it's hard because the top 4 books I feel like could shift depending on my mood, but I read like 4 of my new all-time favorite books this year, and then I was genuinely surprised by some of the other books that were on this list, and I feel like I have got a good variety of genres on the list. So without further ado, let's jump into my favorite books from this year. Starting off at number 10 is actually a book that I listened to on audio at the beginning of this month, so it crept its way on the end of this list. And I always try to stay optimistic in December, where I'm like, I could read another favorite, but with there only being like 2 weeks left in the year, I was like, there needs to be a cutoff. But I read this the first week of December, and that is Cultish by Amanda Montell. This is a nonfiction book, and Amanda Montell is like a social psychologist, and she dives into like language used by different like cult leaders or cult-like organizations, such as like a multi-level marketing scheme. And she is like word nerd, which girl after my own heart. That's what I find interesting too. And she talks about like the different ways that language is used, how it evolves, and how it's like a very persuasive, charismatic person delivering this type of language. But that's specifically with cults, but then like she also gets into language that's cult-like, but not exactly. Like she talks about how like CrossFit is kind of cultish in nature, and not only like how the language affects this, but like how people like interact with each other, and if you see like one person doing it, like the social influence then plays into it as well. It was such an interesting book. There were a lot of like really great examples to latch onto. You can tell that Amanda Montell is very well researched, and she actually reads the audiobook too, which just enhanced the whole experience. I listened to this like while I was driving to work, home from work, running errands, and I was never bored the entire time while reading it. I really loved this. Number 9 is starting off the first of the few romances that actually made my top favorites this year. So number 9 is Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. And I know I'm not the only person who deeply loved this book. I felt like this was Abby Jimenez at her best. We meet 2 characters by the name of Justin and Emma, and it all begins with like a Reddit thread, which is kind of an interesting setup. It's a very modern contemporary romance, but Justin is like posting on like an Am I the Asshole Reddit string where he names like his ugly little dog after his roommate, who then started dating one of the girls that he had previously dated. All's good, but Justin's like talking about this curse that he has where every time he dates someone and they break up, the girl goes and marries the love of her life. Like the next person she dates is the love of her life. And so our other main character, Emma, sees this Reddit thread and is like, oh my god, I have this same thing happening to me. So the two like start talking online, and then they decide like, what if we met up in person, we dated just for the summer, and then hypothetically if we broke up, then the next person we would date would be the love of our life. So that's like the whole setup for the story. And like Emma's a traveling nurse, and she and her best friend go to stay in Minnesota where Justin and his family live to like kind of set up the story. But I think why this story like connected with me so much is the deeply emotional like issues that were happening with the characters. They felt like very real people with very real problems, and that like carried throughout the whole book. Like Justin has to take care of his younger siblings, and Emma has some like really traumatic issues with her mom that she hasn't even really like come to realize, and they're both working through a lot of trauma, but they also like their love for each other kind of keeps them through that. But I love how that didn't like take away from the story, it just added to the story, and it like didn't make the story feel cheap at all. Like sometimes in a romance book you get like the third act breakup or conflict that just feels like really stupid in its miscommunication. No, this book like handled it how real life would, and that's what I appreciated most about it. This was like a raw, real depiction of the complexities of navigating family life, relationships, and sense of purpose. I really, really loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I think I listened to the audiobook in like a day. Number 8 on the list is also another romance book. I feel like the romance books that I did read, I really, really enjoyed, or like I did not like at all. But I read a slew of very high quality 4.5 to 5-star romances. But number 8 is none other than Happy Place by Emily Henry. I know, you probably thought it was going to be the other Emily Henry on this list, but no. I think this is probably my new favorite Emily Henry book, and I don't care what the haters say because I loved how deeply emotional this story was. So we're following our 2 main characters, Wynne and Harriet, and they, every year with their friends, go to this cabin in Maine and have like a little friends getaway. It's their happy place where they all meet up and share good memories and whatnot. And 2 of their friends are getting married, so the whole crew gets back together after being, you know, in their adult lives, living separate for a while. But the problem is, Wynne and Harriet called off their engagement and didn't tell their friends, so they have to show up and pretend that they're still together because they don't want to ruin their friend's wedding. And the story goes from there. This book is miscommunication done right. I absolutely despise the miscommunication trope when it's something as simple as like missing context and whatnot, but this story, oh my gosh, the book almost made me cry. Like, I was reading this in front of my fiance's family at the time because we were all just hanging out, and I was like getting a little teary-eyed because you can tell that Wynne and Harriet just like love each other so much, but it's that fear of like not being good enough, or like I can't give you everything you want because I don't even know what I want. The like yearning and pining for each other is just so beautiful, and the depiction of adult friendships in this book, like now that, you know, I'm a few years removed from college now, it really like put things into some perspective for me, that I have a little bit of that now, where you won't get to see your college friends forever and relationships change, like your views on life change. And I thought that was beautifully done through especially Kimmy, the friend. I really liked her story in this book. Just such a well done story. You can tell that Emily Henry plans out her characters well. She has themes that she's going for, and she writes the human condition so very well. Even though people are all like very different in her stories, her characters are very distinct. They all have such a relatability to them, and I just love her writing. So I'm so happy that I finally got into this and continued through, because the first time I tried to read it, I got 50 pages in and said no, and then I tried again, and I'm so glad I did. This was fantastic. Number 7 on the list is our fantasy book that made it to the top 10, and this is probably going to be a new favorite series of mine. I know a lot of people have been talking about it on the internet for a long time, but I finally hopped on the train this year, and that book is none other than The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I really, really enjoyed this book. It felt like it was an anime in my head in the best way possible. I think Rin is one of my like new favorite characters of all time. So if you don't know, The Poppy War is like a high Asian-inspired fantasy story where we're following our main character Rin, and she's from a very poor, distant village, but she gets the opportunity to study at this like military school called Sign Guard, which is really hard to get into, but she gets in, and the story goes from there. It's her preparing for this war, navigating like different relationships, different like wealth disparities, and she's not set up for success in this world, but she decides that she just needs to take control of her own life. So she goes and she starts studying, and then she meets a professor that changes the rest of her life because he shows her shamanism and starts to unlock these different powers, and there's an impending war with the Federation that's kind of the opposing force, and this book is just so well done. And it's so amazing to me that R.F. Kuang can write in such different like genres than the way that she does. But this story, like the magic and connections to gods was so intriguing. The different relationships with the characters, like Katai was super interesting too. And I really liked Venka, and Najong was the other one. yeah, all of those characters really, really enjoyed. Alton, oh my god, he was so cool too. Like, the characters are very memorable in this book. I feel like I have vivid scenes, and the opening of this book, I don't know why, is like one of my favorite things ever, where you have a character who's kind of like not set up to do well, but they prove the system wrong and get through. I remember reading that first like 100 pages like it was crack. It was so good, and I can't wait to see where we go from here. I've almost been like nervous to start the second book because I know it's gonna like consume my thoughts, and it is heavy. I highly recommend looking up trigger warnings before you go into this, because this is not a light read. There is a lot going on, and I feel like I'm going to be emotionally destroyed by the end of the series. Number 6 on this list is one that I did not expect at all. This book was not really on my radar necessarily, but it's in a genre that I don't typically gravitate towards. Like, it has to be like really, really interesting setup for me to want to give it a go. And that book was None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. I freaking loved this book. I was shocked how much I liked this. I had to know what was gonna happen next, and I listened to it on audio, which was even cooler because there's like a whole podcast element. Oh, the audio production is just top-notch quality. I really enjoyed it. This book follows 2 characters. They're 2 women in their 40s. We follow Alex and Josie. They're living very different lives. Alex is the podcast star, like has had a very successful career. She interviews like important or interesting women, whereas Josie feels like she's kind of missed out on life, missed her opportunity to do something, and she wants to make a change. So it all begins because they're in the same restaurant on their birthdays, which they share, and they find out that they share them because they like have an interaction in the bathroom. And it all begins because Josie's like, I want to be interviewed on your podcast, because, you know, we're birthday twins. And Alex is like, that could be interesting. And boy, was it! It escalated into a lot more than I ever had anticipated. But I don't normally read, like, thriller books, but I was thrilled. It did its job. Like, the writing in it was very interesting. We had complex characters, facing, like, complex issues, and that's the whole thing of the book, is like you don't really know what's true even by the end, and it was kind of like mind twisty, and I still think I've like been not able to stop thinking about it because it annoys me so much, because I want to know what the truth actually was, but I won't ever get that closure, and I think that's amazing. I just thought the characters were super interesting. It was like a psychology study in a way too, and I still don't know what's true. I will never know what's true, but I freaking enjoyed this book, and that's truth. Okay, we're halfway through the list now, and it's so weird just wrapping up things so quickly after a whole 12 months of reading. But number 5 is another romance book, and it's a repeat author. Number 5 is none other than Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez, and I read this book back in January. I listened to it on audio, and I listened to it in audio so quickly. Like, I know that I'm gonna love a book if I literally am laying in bed at night and I'm like, I cannot sleep until I finish this much more chapters, because I had to know. I had to know what was gonna happen. I really loved this story, and this was my first like tiptoe into like the Part of Your World like companion trio, you know, and I just was swept away by this story. We're following Alexis and Daniel. Alexis is a big city girl with a nice doctor job. She works in like, she's like I think she's a doctor. I don't want to like mess up the terminology. She's a doctor in the emergency department of this big city, big corporation that like her family is kind of like doctor royalty at. It's like a whole weird thing. And then we have our other main love interest, who's Daniel, and he's Mr. Small Town, and I'm usually not like a small town boy kind of gal, but this man, I would die for him. Daniel is like a kind, caring handyman of this town. He's also like the mayor and has like takes care of his friend's baby goats. Like, he's just the most wholesome man. And they meet because Alexis is driving, gets a flat tire in the middle of nowhere, and Daniel sees her on the side of the road, comes and helps her out, and the two kind of like hit it off immediately. Then they find out that there is a 10-year difference between them. She lives in the city, he doesn't, and they're like, oh my god, how would this ever work? But they are just so, like, initially drawn to each other and so intrigued and, like, kind of instantly obsessed with each other that they want to make it work. And you want to know how they make it work. This book was so much fun, and it is the perfect, like, romance to get someone involved in it. There's not really, like, a ton of, like, spice in it or anything. It's mostly just, like, the emotional, like, wax and wane with each other, and that's why I love Abby Jimenez's writing so much, because it's more about, like, the emotional connection between the characters. I loved all 3 of the books from Abby Jimenez's, like, companion series, but this one I still think is my favorite of the bunch because it started it all, and it just reminded me why I love reading a good little goofy romance book. Number 4 is another book that kind of surprised me. It was always a book I heard about and I figured I would like it, but I didn't think it was going to absolutely consume my soul. The book in question is Shark Heart by Emily Habeck. What the heck is this? Like, I was blindsided. I was blindsided by how good this was. It has, like, a magical realism concept. So in this world, like, humans with, like, a terminal or chronic illness will shift into animals. So, like, our main characters, Lewis and Ren, they're married, and Lewis receives the diagnosis that it's kind of like an allegory for an aggressive, like, cancer or terminal illness, and they're like, yeah, you're turning into a great white shark. And he's like, okay. So the story sounds kind of weird, but it's a story not only about navigating, like, a loved one having this chronic illness and how your life changes after that, but it's also a sense of, like, how we see time and how we, like, go after our purposes and our dreams, and how other people react to your diagnosis and how your whole life changes because of that. I empathized with Lewis so much throughout this book, and the book talks about chronic pain in such a way where I was getting emotional about it, and the book is, like, kind of an experimental little thing. Like, it's so fast to get through. Like, it's a 400-page book, but some of the things are very short, and since Lewis, like, wanted to be a screenplay writer, there are, like, some chapters that are written like a screenplay. There are some that are more like poetry. There's a lot of great variety in this book, and I read this in 2 days, like, physically, which I don't normally do, but if I'm completely consumed by a book like that, that's how I know it's, like, one of my favorites. And I was so happy that I got a copy of this. I usually want to tab books that I'm really, really enjoying, but I did not even want to stop reading this book or, like, pause to pull out a tab because I just wanted to keep going. The writing in this is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever seen, and I'm going to pull an example. Okay, you ready for this? In this evanescent moment, the love of his life and the moon became indistinguishable from each other, casting everything Lewis feared about the future in the real but temporary light of goodness. This book was a delight to read. I will recommend it to anyone who loves emotional, character-driven stories, anyone who likes literary fiction. I think you would really, really love and resonate with this book. Next on the list, I don't have the physical copy of this book, but once it comes out in paperback, you can bet I will be the first person in line to go get it. This is by one of my new favorite authors, that's Coco Mellors, and Blue Sisters. What can I say about this book? I love this book with my whole heart, soul, chest, every single one of my body parts. I love this book. This book is about 4 sisters, the Blue Sisters. It's Avery, Lucky, Bonnie, and Nikki, and their sister Nikki passes away, and it's the 3 of them a year after, still kind of going through the grieving process, picking up the pieces of this broken relationship between the 3 of them remaining. And it's interesting because we get a perspective from the 3 sisters, but we learn about Nikki through their eyes. And this book, oh my gosh, this book wrote about chronic pain in a way where I wish I could have, like, written down every single thing that it mentioned. And the different sisters each have something, like, really strange going on in their life. They're grappling with things, but this is also a beautiful story about like autonomy and what we want to do with our lives. Just there were so many little nuances with this story, so well written. I will never forget the first page because it talks about what a sister is, and I've never actually had a full sister. Like, I've had stepsisters, but I don't have a real sister. And that page made me feel like I have a sister. I'm really close with my brother, so like the family connections and everything were still there. But oh my gosh, this book, Coco Malors writes in a way that I've never seen before, and I hope to see more of. We've finally cracked the top 2. And this was hard because I was going back and forth again with the top 3, and then sometimes Shark Heart, about what my favorite book would be. I have my reasoning for why number 1 is number 1, but let me talk about number 2 first, because this book is still very, very special to me, and I still think about it quite a bit. That book is none other than Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. Wow, this was incredible. This was such a well-written story. It wasn't like a fast-paced like thriller, because it's shelved as a thriller. It is a well-paced story. Like, you're never bored because there's always something new, and just the leads in this story are fantastic. So we're following Pamela and Ruth are the 2 perspectives, and so this is like a fictionalized version of the Ted Bundy murders that happened at a sorority house in Florida, and Pamela was actually the president of the sorority, and she was the eyewitness who saw Ted Bundy like leaving the house. Except I love they never say his name, they just refer to him as like a man or the defendant the entire time, because this story is about the women and we love it. This definitely feels like a time capsule. Like, you're reading about the late 70s, but it's through the perspective of women dealing with like really incompetent law enforcement, not being believed, like the slapping the word hysteria on things. There is a lot that this book covers that I just, oh my goodness, it made me think about true crime in a way that I've never thought before, where we kind of like idolize these serial killers and like talk about how smart they are and how cunning and charming and yada yada yada. But when you get it from like a woman's perspective, he was actually kind of like a creepy dude that got away with something because he was charming to other men. I do understand that there were some criticisms with this book about like some people's names were not necessarily changed, and like talking about a true crime story while critiquing true crime in general. There was a lot of commentary about that, but for me, I feel like Jessica Knoll did this in such a way where it didn't feel cheap. This book is full of like rich storytelling. You can tell that there was a lot of care put into the writing, and so many people wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't as good as it is. Like, this book is one that I recommend to people when they like love thrillers but they want to maybe try something that's not exactly that. Like, I've recommended this to 2 people this year so far, and both of them have loved it. Like, this is just a book that I will say is iconic. I think people are going to be talking about this for the next couple of years. I really, really loved this. We have gotten to the very last book on the list, number 1, the best book that I read this year. I feel like it might be surprising for some people. My favorite book that I read this year was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. Oh my gosh. I don't understand how people don't like this book. I loved this story so much. This book, it's tabbed to oblivion. I could not stop reading it. This reminded me why I loved reading so much. It was something that I could like sit down and enjoy, and then I would look at the clock and be like, oh my god, that much time went by. I was in another world. I was transported. This story is the prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy by Suzanne Collins, and this might be one of my favorite books, like, from that trilogy. I don't want to say it is my favorite, but it kind of is, you know? This is President Snow's backstory, and while there was a lot of criticism when this book first came out in like 2020 that it was just a cash grab and a villain origin story, and they were trying to make him sympathetic. This man is not sympathetic at all. Like, if you read it and felt sympathy for him, you're wrong. I'm saying that in a joking way, but the point of it is that he's supposed to be terrible, the whole story is a depiction of like human nature, and I love that. I love philosophical questions explored through characters and their actions and why they act the way that they are. Snow is supposed to be an insufferable person who thinks he's righteous, and I love that kind of stuff. Suzanne Collins wrote from the villain's perspective so well that he didn't even know he was the villain. And every conversation he had with Dr. Gall was super interesting. Sejanus in this story, oh my gosh, she's the perfect foil to Snow. It has so much commentary, not only on like human nature and how people are the way that they are, but also about like violence and like the glorification of violence, and especially like violence against children. Like this shows the Hunger Games before it became the Hunger Games, and it just is so sick and twisted. It's made me so excited for Sunrise on the Reaping now that I literally cannot think about anything else. Like the amount of times that I've thought about this book throughout the entire year is what solidified it as my favorite, because for a while I was like, wow, I loved that, it's 5 stars, but it probably won't be my favorite of the year. And then I kept thinking about it. There are so many instances in this story where I was just on the edge of my seat wanting to know what happened next. And Suzanne Collins doesn't write something unless she has something to say, and she had things to say about humanity. I loved this book. It's my favorite of the year. I know a lot of people will probably disagree, but that's okay. I'm just glad that this book exists. So here are the ones that I own physically, and that's where I'm going to wrap up this video. My favorite books of this year are very special to me because I feel like this was one of the best reading years I've had in a long time. I'll probably be making more end of the year content soon, but I first wanted to talk about what my favorite books were and get some positivity out there before we talk about the rest. I'm really excited to see what comes out of 2025, and I'm so thankful for the really great books that I read in this year of 2024. So thank you for spending some time with me, and let me know what your favorite book of the year was down below. You can follow me on Instagram. I'm by the same name over there, Pages and Pastimes, and I'll see you I'll see you next time with more end of the year content. Bye!